Well, I was going to put up my stone wall for added effect, but I don't think I have a good way to put it up. So, oh well. Alrighty. You know, I was thinking about taking this off at the beginning of the video, but I kinda like it, so maybe I'll just leave it on. Hola mis amigues, kind of Wafa. Welcome back to Careena's Adventures. So today I have my historical looking French hood on, and that means that at last we are talking about writing historical fiction. I have been waiting to do a video on this. I was kind of waiting because it's my specialty, so I just wanted to wait until I felt like the time was right, and now I've decided to do one. So today I'm going to be sharing with you ways that you can get started in writing historical fiction and learning how to research it, whether you aren't sure what time period you want to do or whether you already do know what time period you want to do. So let's dive right in and get started. The first thing is for if you don't know what time period you want to write your story in. You should at least be thinking about what kind of is the main occupation, the main theme, what is it in your story that you're most interested in, that's most important to you. Do you want it to be on a ship? Is it village life? Is it orphans? That will give you something specific to research. Let me explain. In my main project, it takes place on a ship, and I had no idea what century I wanted this to be in. I mean, I knew it had to be sometime after the life of Christ because they're Christians, or the main character is a Christian in the story. And so I knew that, but I didn't really know much else. So I had to figure out kind of approximately what era-ish, or just kind of the general, you know, do I want it to be like the Roman times? Do I want it to be the medieval times? Do I want it to be a little bit more recent? And so basically I landed kind of more on the 1600s to 1700s-ish era, and then that led me to step 2, which is to consider what you think of the people as looking like, or what you want them to look like. And by this I mean, like, you know, for me, the 1600s I landed on because, partly because it worked, the sailing situation of the time worked with the story for the amount of crew that I needed, but I also liked the costumes, they weren't costumes, they were their real clothes. The clothes back then that people wore. And so I picked it partly for practical reasons, but also because I did like it. Now, you don't have to pick an era that other people are doing just because it's a popular era. For me, I have actually found that the 1600s were a little bit more difficult to do research for than the 1700s. They were part of the golden age of sailing, but most people think of the 1700s when they think of the golden age of sailing and the golden age of piracy, because that's when, you know, we had the traditional, you know, three-pointed hats and Blackbeard and things like that that most people think of. So it was a little bit trickier, but it's what I wanted and it's what worked best for the story, so that's good. So that brings us to research. So I kind of pretty much already described this. Whenever you're trying to decide on a place or a time period, just do some research, you know, about what's important to you, whether it's just for aesthetic reasons or, like I said, practical reasons in the story. For me, the clothing and the religious/political situations are important because I have to know kind of what the general Christian thought was at the time in order to understand how my personal views, as I kind of place them into the main Christian characters, if you will look against what was normal for the time, or if it's even feasible for the time. So step 4, once you have decided on a setting, whether this was, you know, research so you could decide, or if you just knew from the beginning, research how people lived. Now this is where it's important that you have picked a time period that interests you. I have time periods that interest me more than others. I'm very fond of the 1600s, but I haven't generally been too fond of things like the 1800s, the 1900s. I did write one Victorian short story, but I mean, research how people lived. You can write down and take notes on whatever you find. You know, it can be fun things as well as practical things. You don't know where details might make their way into the story. You might have to find some data kind of from the approximate time, depending on how far back it is and which time period it is. In my story that takes place on a ship, it was pretty difficult to find information in the 1600s. There was some information on Magellan, which was in the 1500s, if I do recall, and information, of course, on more like, Blackbeard's time in the 1700s, but there wasn't really a whole lot in between. And so what I had to do in that instance is figure out kind of the gist of sailing and ships and things like that from those, and then I had to find more of just the clothing, the outfits from other sources. The other thing is, if you can find an occurrence in this time period that was significant, then you may be able to research that. For example, in the 1600s, there was a very significant sailing event. It was the Pilgrims coming to America. So thankfully, I was actually able to do quite a bit of research around that, at the very least, to understand, what people wore and kind of understand the Christian thinking of the time. And of course, there were, you could find a little bit of information about sailing too, because of the Mayflower, but that really helped me get further into the people's lives part of it. So where do you find this information? Obviously, the internet is a great resource. You do have to be careful because some sites know what they're talking about more than others. But one of the things I actually love to do is go to the library and look at kids' books on the historical subjects. They tend to be clean, they tend to be straightforward, and they're just kind of fun because, it's colorful, there's illustrations. I especially love DK books. It can be difficult when you're researching a historical story because history can be such a dark subject, especially if you're doing something like, kings and queens or sailors, which inevitably a lot of the information is going to be about pirates, which, I was really trying to avoid because I didn't really want to be researching about pirates at the time. The nice thing about kids' books is that they're going to mostly be clean, straightforward. If you are concerned about things like that, they can be a great resource. You can also, with much caution, maybe do some research on YouTube if you can possibly find some living history pieces where people are, wearing the clothes, telling you about their lives. I'm not guaranteeing you're going to find anything, let alone anything accurate in this area, but it could be worth considering once you already have done some research with more reliable sources and kind of get a little bit better of an idea of what you're doing, and then kind of move into that. As a side note, you can also just explore the everyday lives of the characters and get into it and have fun in other ways. For example, you see here that I am wearing this French hood that I made fairly recently. I like the costume and the way that people dress. That's a big thing for me. I really enjoy that. So you can see here that I have my French hood on, which is more from the Tudor period. I actually haven't written anything from the Tudor period, really, but it fascinates me anyway, so I like to make costumes of it. And, I have a little Spanish kind of fan over here, and over here hanging up I have a very inaccurate but still cool nonetheless three-pointed hat. Please do not use this for a drawing off of. It is not the most accurate example of a three-pointed hat, but it is a three-pointed hat anyway. Even though it is absolutely enormous, I'm wearing a bun, so it's a little hard to put on and does not look very good on me. So just, you can, find fun ways, this is just from Party City, by the way, to kind of experience how people lived. Maybe cook some recipes from the time period, understand what they ate, how they lived. It can kind of help you get into character and live the life they lived, and some role play. You're never too old for role play. Sit, very crooked. Oh well. Number 5, as you are writing, you can kind of put the things you've learned into the book, and if you do come to something that you are not sure your research just doesn't cover, it's no big deal. You can go back and research that later. You don't have to have researched every possible aspect of the person's life or the people's life back then. You can do some extra research as you go if you come to specific things that you need to know about. What you don't want to do, what I made the mistake of doing, is I wrote the entire story before I decided what time period I wanted it to be in, which ended up being okay, but it would have saved me a lot of editing to have already decided what time period and kind of the basics of culture and what was appropriate and how they think and stuff like that. Number 6, lastly, as you're writing a book of historical fiction and doing this research, search for common themes. Search for ideas and notions and nuances that have not changed and are common to all people still today. I'm talking about things like love and freedom and a woman maybe wondering where her place is in the world. That's a common one that I have in my books. Things that all people have dealt with, and you can show in a new light because of the cultural implications. And of course, there are going to be tendencies to interpret these issues according to contemporary thought. You're not going to be able to get around that, but being able to include some like cultural implications on that idea of whatever it is, you can show a new light on it, and also just show it from a different perspective that maybe your readers hadn't thought of. That's one of the beautiful things about historical fiction, is that you're ultimately showing a world to your reader that can make them see our world in a new light. So I hope that this video has been helpful. It's kind of my specialty, but it's really hard to boil all of this down into like one video. So if you have any other ideas or anything that you'd like to know more about, do drop it down in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please subscribe, and do make sure to follow me on Instagram and Pinterest at Careena's Adventures, and I will see you next time. Adios mis amigas y Dios le bendiga. Bye bye.